Montana Territory. Spring of 1883, the wind cut sharp through the Bitterroot Valley as the train hissed to a halt in the tiny town of Darby. And Frances Deering stepped off with her carpetbag clutched tight in both hands. She was 22, her cheeks pink from the cold and her dark brown hair pinned in a neat twist beneath her bonnet. Her dress was plain but clean, the hem already dusted with cinders. She searched the platform until her eyes landed on a tall man in a worn wool coat, holding a hat low over his brow. He had sharp shoulders, a thick mustache, and hard eyes that looked her up and down without a word. "You Frances?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said, trying to smile. "Frances Deering." "I'm Elias Moore," the man said. "Let's go." There was no handshake, no welcome. That was her husband. The ride to his homestead was silent and long. The land stretched wide pine trees, scrub, and the last melt of snow. Frances looked out the wagon side, her stomach tight. This was not how she imagined it. She had answered his letter because he'd sounded kind. A widower, he said. Needed help with his land. Wanted a wife to share a life with. But now she sat beside him, and the only warmth came from the heavy blanket she tucked around her knees. By nightfall, they reached a small cabin leaning to one side. The inside smelled of smoke and old stew. Elias showed her the wood stove, pointed at a pile of blankets on a cot in the corner. "That's yours," he said. "We'll see how things go." She nodded, even though her throat burned. The next 3 weeks passed in silence and chores. Frances scrubbed until her knuckles bled, cooked meals she barely touched, and tried not to cry when the wind howled at night. Elias barely spoke. He left before dawn and returned after dark, and when he did talk, it was only to ask for food or complain about the noise she made when sweeping. Then came the morning he didn't say anything at all, just dropped her bag at her feet and opened the door. "I changed my mind," he said. "You are not what I need." She stood there, stunned. What do you mean? "I do not want you here. You can go back to wherever you came from." "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. "That is not my concern." She blinked against the cold. "Please, can we just talk?" "No," he said. "You are not my wife. I never said vows. You can leave." And then he turned his back. Frances walked. Her boots sank into the damp earth, her legs ached, and the sky grew heavy with gray. She followed the rutted wagon road, not knowing where it led, numb from shock and cold. Her carpetbag grew heavier with each mile. By dusk, her feet slipped in the mud and she fell, skinning her knees. She sat in the dirt and cried for the first time since arriving. Not loud, just quiet tears, her breath hitching and fogging in the air. A horse's hooves came slow around the bend. She looked up, startled, wiping her face with her sleeve. The rider was tall and broad-shouldered, dismounting before the horse had fully stopped. He had a clean jaw, the lines of his face weathered by sun and wind, and his voice was deep when he spoke. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She tried to stand. "No, it is nothing." He stepped closer, eyes scanning her torn skirt and bruised palms. "You are not from here, no. What is your name?" "Frances," she said, voice shaking. "Frances Deering," he nodded once. "I am Hayes Tolan." "Come on, you are freezing." "I cannot trouble you. You are not a trouble," he said simply, and reached out his hand. She took it. Hayes lifted her into the saddle behind him and wrapped her hands around the horn. His coat smelled faintly of pine and horses, and his body was warm against hers. They rode through the dark, past trees and riverbanks until a low cabin came into view, light glowing faint behind the shutters. Inside, it was clean and quiet. A fire crackled in the hearth. Hayes set a kettle on the stove, then took her bag and set it by the door. "You can stay here," he said. "I have an extra room. You need rest." She sat stiffly on the chair. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her then. "No woman should be left out in the cold." "I was a mail-order bride," she said. "He turned me out, just like that." Hayes' jaw worked. He poured water into a basin and brought it to her. "Then he is no kind of man," he said. That night she lay in the bed he had made for her, the quilt soft and smelling of cedar. She stared at the ceiling, heart pounding slow and deep. She did not understand why kindness should make her want to cry more than cruelty. But it did. The next morning, the sun filtered through the curtains, and she heard pans clinking in the kitchen. She rose, washed, and stepped out to find Hayes frying eggs. "You can stay as long as you need," he said, not looking up. Frances hesitated. "I do not intend to be a burden." "You are not," he he said again, voice steady. "But if you want to be useful, there is dough rising near the stove. Could use a hand with baking." She pulled her sleeves up. "I can do that." Days passed, then a week, then two. Spring melted into early summer and Frances found herself smiling again. She fed the hens, helped mend the fence. Hayes taught her how to ride his second gelding, and she laughed the first time she galloped over the hill, wind in her hair. One afternoon, as she hung laundry in the sun, Hayes stood a few feet away, splitting wood. She watched the muscles in his arms flex under his shirt, the way he paused now and again to wipe his brow with the back of his hand. When he caught her staring, he said nothing, just gave her a small nod, his eyes warm. That night they sat by the fire, both with mugs of coffee in hand. It was quiet, the world outside soft with stars and crickets. "You never married?" she asked gently. "No," he said. "Too much moving around." "Never found someone who made me want to stay." She looked at him then, her heart thumping. "And now," he turned his head slowly to face her. "Now I do not want you to leave." She did not speak, just reached out, her fingers brushing his. He took her hand in his without hesitation. And it was the first time in her life she felt truly safe. The first time Hayes reached for the small book beside the hearth. Frances was kneading bread at the table, her sleeves rolled above her elbows. She didn't pause, but her gaze flicked briefly to him. "You read much?" she asked, folding the dough with practiced rhythm. Hayes opened the worn cover and let the pages settle. "Only at night," he said. "Helps quiet the mind," she nodded, dusted her hands with flour. "My father used to read aloud after supper. Psalms, mostly. Sometimes he'd let me choose a chapter." Her voice softened. I missed the sound of his voice. Hayes didn't answer right away. The lamplight cast gold across his face, deepening the lines at the corners of his eyes. "What happened to him? He passed 3 winters ago," she said, keeping her eyes on the dough. "Fever took him fast. After that, everything changed." He turned a page. "That why you answered the letter?" Frances brushed her palms together and reached for the towel to drape over the tin. "It was part of it. My mother died when I was young, and my aunt didn't have room for me once her own daughters married. I figured it was marriage or work in someone's kitchen." Hayes closed the book gently and set it back on the shelf. "You're not a woman made for someone else's kitchen." She looked over, surprised. "How would you know? I've watched you patch a fence line, trim a hoof, break a colt's bad habit in 2 days. You've got grit, Frances." She turned away, suddenly unsure what to do with the warmth blooming in her chest. "I only did what was needed." "That's the kind that lasts," he said. The next morning, a knock came at the door just after sun-up. Hayes was already hauling water from the well, so Frances dried her hands and answered it. An older man stood outside, his beard white and coat patched at the elbows. "Morning, ma'am," he said kindly. "I'm looking for Hayes, name's Merritt. I come through once a month trading mules and odd goods." Frances stepped aside. "He's just out back." Merritt nodded and walked around the side of the house. When Hayes returned, he carried 2 bundles leather straps and a sack of oats and said nothing until the man's wagon creaked down the road. "Used to ride with him," Hayes said, setting the feed near the barn wall. "Drove freight through the Judith Gap before the rails came." Frances leaned against the post. "You've done a lot of things." He looked at her, then past her toward the distant ridgeline. "Spent years drifting. Thought maybe if I kept moving, I'd outrun some of what I carried." She didn't press. Instead, she walked to the garden and knelt among the new rows of beans, pressing soil around the shoots. He joined her with a pail and helped water them, moving slow, careful with each stem. "You plan to stay in Derby?" she asked after a while. "I didn't," he said. "Not until this spring." Her hands stilled in the dirt. That evening, as thunder rolled far off over the mountains, they sat on the porch, a jar of oil between them for sharpening blades. Frances turned the whetstone over in her palm before setting a knife to it. "My brother enlisted," she said quietly. "Union side, never came back." Hayes handed her a cloth. "You were close. He was all I had for a long time. Taught me how to climb trees and how to spit farther than the neighbor boys." She smiled faintly, and Hayes watched her, his expression unreadable. "I buried a brother too," he said. "Different war, different years, but the ache's the same." They didn't say more. The sun sank low, drawing long shadows across the porch. Hayes stood and reached for the lantern. "You hungry?" Frances nodded. "I'll boil the beans." There's salt pork left from yesterday. That night, after dishes were done and the fire burned low, she lingered by the hearth while Hayes checked the latch on the door. When he turned, she was watching him. "I don't think I thanked you," she said. He stepped closer, slow and sure. "You don't need to. I want to." He studied her for a long moment and then, gently, he reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You changed the feel of this place," he said. "I didn't know it could be like this, quiet but not empty." She looked up at him, heart thudding. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "Then don't." And this time, when she took his hand, he didn't let go. June brought warmth that settled into the valley like a long exhale. Grass grew tall along the creeks, and the high country snow retreated farther up the slopes. Frances stood at the edge of the pasture, one hand on her hip, watching the filly Hayes had been working with for weeks. Her coat gleamed like polished chestnut in the sun, and she moved with cautious grace under the saddle now, no longer flinching at the bit. "She's coming along," Frances said as Hayes approached, a coil of lead rope over his shoulder. "She trusts easier than I expected," he said, glancing at the horse, then at her. "Takes time, patience." Frances wiped her palms on her apron. "That's how it was with me too." Hayes didn't smile, but his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than habit. They walked back toward the cabin in companionable silence. The porch boards creaked beneath their boots, and when they stepped inside, the smell of stew simmering over the fire greeted them. Frances stirred the pot while Hayes poured water into the basin to wash. "Town's holding a gathering next week," he said, scrubbing his forearms with the bar of lye soap. 4th of July. Folks bring food, play music. It's the only time most of them show their faces twice in a month. She glanced up from the pot. "You planning to go?" "I haven't in years," he said. "But I thought maybe this time." He didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need him to. "I'd like that," she said, voice quiet. That night, she sat at the table darning one of his shirts while Hayes whittled near the hearth. The flick of his knife against the wood was slow and methodical, and the shape forming beneath his hands looked like the head of a bird, sharp-beaked, wings tucked. "You knew your mother?" Frances asked. He looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Until I was 12. She died in childbirth." "My sister didn't survive either." She set the shirt down on her lap. "I'm sorry." "I remember her voice," he said, returning to the carving. "She used to sing when she thought no one was listening, always something soft. Nothing you'd hear in a saloon." "Mine used to hum while she brushed my hair," Frances said. "I think that's what I miss most, the small things." Hayes didn't speak again, but when he finished the bird, he set it on the table beside her thread spool. "For you," he said. She picked it up gently. The wings were curved just slightly forward, as though it were gliding toward something toward her. She traced the lines with her fingertip, then looked up at him, her eyes bright. "I'll keep it by the window." The day of the gathering came with a clear sky and a breeze that rippled through the grass like waves. Frances wore the blue calico dress she'd found tucked in the back of the wardrobe in the spare room, a dress that didn't smell of smoke or wear, but of cedar and lavender. She braided her hair and wrapped it with ribbon, her hands unsteady with the unfamiliar motion. Hayes waited outside, already saddled. When she stepped onto the porch, he blinked once, slow. "You look like you belong in the sun," he said simply. They rode into town side by side. Scattered wagons and buggies lined the edge of the churchyard, and children darted between tables of pies and pickles. Someone played a fiddle near the steps, and the air buzzed with voices, laughter, and the occasional bark of a dog tied under a wagon. Hayes kept close without hovering. Frances met glances with cautious nods at first, but when Mrs. Callan, a round woman with honey-colored braids and a basket of biscuits, handed her a plate and asked her name, she found herself answering without hesitation. "Frances Tolan," she said. The words surprised her. Hayes, standing just behind, didn't correct it. They found a place under an elm, the shade cool, the grass soft beneath their boots. Hayes cut slices of pie with his belt knife and handed her the first piece. "You mind I didn't ask you properly," he said as she took a bite. She looked at him over the tin plate. "That depends. On what? Whether you plan to." He set his plate aside and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I've spent years thinking I didn't deserve peace, that it wasn't meant for men like me, but you." He hesitated, then met her gaze full. You make me want to build something that'll last longer than fences and firewood." She set the pie down, heart-thudding. "I didn't come west to fall in love," she said. "But I did, quietly, all at once." Hayes took her hands, calloused against calloused, and held them like something sacred. "Will you be my wife, Frances?" he asked. She nodded, no tears, no trembling. "Yes, I will." They returned home as the sun bent low behind the hills, casting long gold over the pasture. The horses walked slow, their hooves muffled in the dirt. When they reached the cabin, Hayes dismounted first, then lifted her down with both hands at her waist. "I'll build you a porch that don't creak," he said. "I like the way it creaks," she answered. And when he kissed her, it was steady, sure, and without rush, the kind of kiss that didn't need promise or pretense. Just two people who had walked through separate storms and found in each other a clearing. Inside, the fire waited, and beside the window, the carved bird faced east toward morning. By midsummer, the mornings began earlier and the evenings stretched longer, the sky lingering in shades of rose and pale gold. Frances rose before the sun most days, the rhythm of the house now stitched into her body like seams in a well-worn dress. She washed in the basin beside the window, braided her hair without fuss, and stepped into the yard with bare arms and steady purpose. She had started keeping a notebook, thin pages bound in rough cloth, a gift Hayes had found in a trader's wagon 2 counties over. She didn't write anything grand, just the names of herbs she was learning, weather patterns, how the milk cow preferred to be handled from the left. It lived in the drawer beside the hearth, and she handled it with care, the way some women held Bibles. One morning, Hayes returned from the southern ridge with a rifle slung across his back and a fresh tear in the sleeve of his shirt. It wasn't deep, but the cloth was ruined. "I slipped coming down the shale," he said, setting the rifle behind the door. "Didn't see the bramble." Frances took the shirt, turned it over in her hands. "You've patched this twice already." He plucked a twig from his collar. "It's lasted longer than I figured. I'll use the brown ticking I found in the crates. Won't match, but it'll hold." He leaned against the wall, arms folded. "I don't mind the look of it patched." She glanced up. "Then you'll love the pair of trousers I stitched yesterday. They've got more mending than original cloth." Hayes chuckled low in his throat, a rare sound, quiet but round. "I ought to be paying you wages." "You've paid me in peace," she said, and the words hung in the air between them. That afternoon, she walked the fence line that bordered the north pasture, a coil of wire in one hand and pliers in the other. She'd grown stronger, her grip surer, her footing better over uneven ground. She worked with her sleeves rolled and her eyes clear, and when Hayes joined her midway down the line, she passed him the wire without needing to ask. He twisted it into place while she steadied the post, her boot pressed firm against the base. "Did you ever think about going back east?" he asked while they worked. She shook her head. "There's nothing there waiting. No cousins or friends, none I'd want to see again." She straightened, dusted her palms. "They all pitied me. Not for losing family, but for not marrying before 20. Hayes stood, eyes narrowed toward the far tree line. "Folks think strange things about women who don't follow a straight road." Her voice was soft. "They think worse of women who choose the wrong one." He didn't answer, but his hand brushed hers as he passed the pliers back, and she didn't let go right away. Later, when the sky turned the color of honey and ash, they sat beside the creek that cut through the edge of the property. Frances had brought a rag to dip in the cool water and a basket of bread ends for the birds that gathered near the reeds. Hayes tossed a pebble into the current. "I was 20 when I first came through this valley. Took a job hauling timber out of the deep woods. Thought I'd stay a few weeks, move on." "What made you stay?" He bent a blade of grass between his fingers. "I couldn't explain it, not even to myself. It was the quiet, the way the air smelled after rain, the stillness. Something in me wanted to be still for once." Frances looked down at the water, its surface broken only by the drift of leaves and the occasional ripple from a passing trout. "I used to think stillness meant being trapped," she said. "But this place, it's different." He looked at her then. "You're not trapped, I know." They sat without speaking for a long while, the hush of the evening broken only by the wind in the cottonwoods. When they returned to the cabin, Hayes added wood to the fire while Frances lit the lamp. She moved through the room with familiarity now, her hands certain. As she reached to draw the curtain closed, she paused, her fingers on the fabric. "I want to marry here," she said. Hayes turned. "Here, in this valley, by the creek maybe, just a few neighbors, nothing grand." "But I want it to be ours," he nodded once. "Then that's how it'll be." She crossed to him, took his hand in both of hers. "I never thought I'd have a say in how my own life turned out." He touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. "You've been choosing every day since you walked down that road." And when he kissed her, it wasn't careful or questioning anymore. It was made of the life they'd begun to build, one choice at a time. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, just after a rain that left the cottonwood leaves slick and shining. They chose the bend in the creek where the water slowed and reflected the sky, where wildflowers had come up in quiet patches, bluebells, prairie smoke, a few late shooting stars. Hayes wore his cleanest shirt, the sleeves still patched from that day on the ridge. Frances wore a dress made from bolt cloth Mrs. Callan helped her stitch, the seams neat, the hem just brushing her boots. Hayes had carved 2 rings from a length of apple wood, soaked and shaped by hand. He pressed one onto her finger without a word, and she did the same for him, her hand steady. The preacher from Derby spoke soft and short, and when he finished, the only sound was the wind in the grass. Afterward, they served bread, dried meat, and rhubarb pie on tin plates to the neighbors and friends who'd come down the trail. Someone played a tune on a fiddle, and a few couples danced beneath the high branches. Frances did not dance, but she sat beside Hayes on a split log, her shoulder against his, watching the light shift between the trees. When the guests rode off and the fire burned low, Hayes took her hand and led her back toward the cabin. The moon had risen, slung low and wide over the hills. The door was already open, he'd left it that way, and inside, the table had been cleared, a fresh sprig of sage set in a jar by the window. Frances turned to face him, her voice quiet enough to match the hush of the room. "You've never asked about what happened in Derby when I first arrived." Hayes shook his head. "Didn't need to. I saw who you were when you walked away from it. I wasn't sure of anything then. I thought maybe I was ruined." "You weren't," he said. "You were unfinished." She stepped closer, resting her hands on his chest. "And now, you're whole, you're mine." They didn't speak more that night. Words had done enough. As summer turned toward its late half, they worked the land as they always had, but now with a rhythm that felt rooted. Frances took to drying herbs on a rack Hayes built for her, and she began learning the names of birds that passed through the valley. Hayes started shaping fence posts in the evenings, not because they were needed, but because he liked the way her voice sounded when she sat near and read aloud from that little notebook. One afternoon, she came back from the creek with a handful of gooseberries and a small grin he hadn't seen before. She handed him the berries, and he looked at her, puzzled. "There's a doe nesting near the southern bend," she said. "I didn't spook her. I just sat and waited. She let me stay." Hayes popped one of the berries in his mouth, tart and sharp. "You're getting to know the land better than I do." "I'm not sure it's the land," she said, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I think it's just the first place that didn't ask me to be someone else." That night, they lay side by side beneath the open window, the air warm and full of crickets. Frances turned to him, her head on his shoulder. "I used to think love had to be loud," she said. "Big declarations. Bright things." Hayes ran his hand down her back, slow. "And now I know it's steady," she said, "like a fire that never goes out." He kissed the top of her head. "I'll keep it burning." The following spring, the garden gave more than they expected: peas, turnips, early greens. Frances had begun writing recipes in the back of her notebook, and Hayes had built her a second shelf in the kitchen to hold jars sealed with wax and twine. One morning, while she was kneading dough, she paused, her hands still buried in flour. "Hayes," she said without turning. He looked up from where he was mending a broken strap. "What is it?" She wiped her palms carefully and crossed to him, placing his hand on her belly. She didn't say anything more, his fingers stilled and then curled gently. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a breath. "I think it's time we added a cradle." He didn't speak right away, just leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll make it strong," he whispered. The years that followed were not without hardship. Some seasons the snow came early, and once, the calf they'd hoped to raise didn't survive the first frost. But the house held warmth, and the quiet between them never turned cold. They planted deeper roots each year, new rows in the garden, new fence lines staked, a maple sapling planted just outside the window where her herbs dried. By the time the child came, the cradle had been carved, smoothed, and lined with wool. Hayes tucked the baby inside with hands that had once held rifle stock and reins, now gentle and certain. Frances sat beside him, her body tired, her eyes full. "She's got your mouth," she said, brushing the baby's cheek. He touched her hair, now longer, streaked with a few strands of gold from the sun. "She'll have your spine." They named her Clara, after the sister Hayes had once lost and never spoken of again. As the child grew, so did the home. Frances taught her to read and to sew, to listen for the change in wind that meant rain, and to walk the creek path without scaring the deer. Hayes taught her to ride and respect the land, to be quiet when quiet was needed, and to speak plain when it wasn't. They never had more children, but the house never felt empty. Neighbors came often, some with news, others just to sit. Frances baked bread that brought people from 2 ridges over, and Hayes traded fence work for kindling bundles and salt pork. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Hayes built a bench beneath the maple tree that had grown tall enough to cast real shade. He didn't say why, but she knew. They sat there in the evenings, Clara playing in the grass nearby, the light soft on the edge of the hills. Frances leaned against his side, her fingers laced through his. "This is the life I never thought I'd have," she said. He turned toward her, his face lined but content. "This is the life we built." And when he kissed her, it was just as it had been that first time, no flourish, no rush. Only love, quiet and sure, the kind that endures. They stayed there in that valley between the hills, where the land held their footsteps and the wind knew their names. Nothing chased them anymore. There was only the soft hush of a life well earned, and the warmth of 2 people who had walked through the dark and found, in each other, the dawn.